On a plantation called Blackwood Manor in rural Mississippi, there existed a room on the third floor of the main house that was permanently locked, that no enslaved worker was ever allowed to enter, and that even white overseers were forbidden from approaching without explicit permission from the owner. A man named Cornelius Blackwood, who kept the only key on a chain around his neck at all times. The enslaved people who worked at Blackwood Manor whispered about this room constantly, developing elaborate theories about what it contained and what Blackwood did there during the hours he spent behind the locked door. Some believed it held treasure that Blackwood had accumulated over decades of slave trading and plantation operations. Others thought it was where he kept records that would incriminate him in crimes beyond the normal cruelties of slavery. A few believed it contained something supernatural, some dark power that Blackwood had bargained with to build his fortune. The truth of what was in that locked room would not be revealed until April 1862, when Union forces occupied the plantation during the early months of the Civil War and forced their way into the room that Blackwood had sealed just before fleeing. What they found inside was so disturbing that the commanding Union officer ordered the room sealed again immediately and classified the reports about its contents for over 80 years. The full truth about Blackwood's forbidden room was not made public until the 1940s, when a historian researching Union Army records discovered the sealed file and brought its contents to light, revealing a horror that exceeded even the darkest whispers that had circulated among the enslaved people who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of that locked dock. Before we descend into the darkness of what Blackwood kept hidden for decades, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we uncover the secrets that powerful people tried to bury forever. Blackwood Manor was established in 1827 by Cornelius Blackwood's father, Thomas Blackwood, who had come to Mississippi from Virginia with modest capital and who had built a substantial fortune through cotton cultivation and through aggressive acquisition of land from smaller farmers who could not compete with large plantation operations. By 1840, when Cornelius inherited the plantation after his father's death, Blackwood Manor consisted of over 3,000 acres worked by 186 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in the county, though not among the absolute largest. Cornelius was 32 years old when he inherited, unmarried, and known for being reclusive and secretive in ways that made even his business associates uncomfortable. He rarely attended social gatherings, conducted most of his business through intermediaries, and lived alone in the main house with only a small number of enslaved house servants who were carefully selected and who were known to be absolutely loyal or absolutely terrified. It was never clear which. The house itself was an imposing Greek Revival mansion, 3 stories tall with massive white columns and elaborately decorated interiors that were typical of wealthy plantation houses in the antebellum South. But unlike most plantation houses which were designed to showcase wealth and to serve as venues for social gatherings, Blackwood Manor felt wrong to visitors in ways that people struggled to articulate. The rooms were too dark, despite large windows. The decorations were slightly off, incorporating symbols and images that did not quite fit with conventional taste. And there was an atmosphere throughout the house that visitors described as oppressive, as though the building itself was hostile to human presence. The forbidden room occupied the entire east wing of the 3rd floor, taking up space that in most plantation houses would have been divided into multiple bedrooms for family members or guests. Cornelius had ordered the construction of this room in 1841, just a year after inheriting the plantation, bringing in specialized carpenters and craftsmen from New Orleans rather than using local labor. The workers who constructed the room were sworn to secrecy about its layout and features, and several of them later reported to authorities that they had been disturbed by specific elements of the construction that Blackwood had insisted upon. These elements included walls that were significantly thicker than necessary for a normal room, multiple layers of locks on a reinforced door, windows that were fitted with metal shutters that could be sealed from the inside, and most disturbing, a floor that incorporated drainage channels leading to pipes that descended through the house's walls to the basement. When workers asked Blackwood why these features were necessary, he provided vague explanations about wanting a secure room for storing valuable documents and about needing ventilation for chemical experiments he planned to conduct. The workers completed the construction in early 1842, and from that point forward, no one except Cornelius Blackwood was allowed inside. Enslaved people who cleaned the rest of the house were explicitly forbidden from entering the third floor. White overseers who managed plantation operations were told that the room was off limits and that attempting to access it would result in immediate dismissal. Visitors to Blackwood Manor were never taken to the third floor, and most were apparently unaware that the forbidden room existed. The enslaved people at Blackwood Manor developed their own understanding of the forbidden room through careful observation of patterns in Blackwood's behavior and through the accumulation of small details that individually seemed insignificant but that collectively painted a disturbing picture. They noticed that Blackwood spent several hours in the room almost every evening, entering around sunset and often not emerging until late at night. They noticed that sometimes Blackwood would be visibly agitated or disturbed when he left the room. Other times he seemed satisfied or even euphoric. They noticed that Blackwood occasionally brought items into the room, items that were often carefully wrapped or concealed, but that sometimes could be identified as books, scientific instruments, or containers of various materials. Most disturbingly, they noticed that certain enslaved people would occasionally be summoned to the main house and would be seen going up to the third floor in Blackwood's company, and that these individuals would sometimes emerge from the house hours later looking traumatized and would refuse to speak about what had happened, while other times individuals who went into the house would simply never emerge at all and would disappear from the plantation entirely. The official explanation for these disappearances was always that the individuals had been sold to traders or had run away, but the pattern of disappearances coinciding with visits to the forbidden room created a different theory among the enslaved community, that Blackwood was doing something in that room that required subjects, and that some of those subjects did not survive whatever was being done to them. One of the few glimpses into what might be happening in the forbidden room came from an enslaved woman named Sarah, who worked as a house servant and who in 1848 was ordered to clean the hallway outside the room. While she was working, the door opened slightly, and Sarah, standing at an angle where she could see through the gap, caught a brief view of the interior before Blackwood noticed and slammed the door shut. She later described what she had seen to other enslaved people in whispered conversations in the slave quarters, creating an account that was passed down orally for decades, and that was eventually recorded by historians interviewing descendants of Blackwood Manor's enslaved community. According to Sarah's description, the room was dominated by a large table covered in books and papers, with walls lined with shelves that held jars containing what looked like preserved specimens, though she could not identify what the specimens were. She saw what appeared to be scientific instruments, including items that looked like they might be medical tools or devices for measuring or recording. And most disturbing, she saw what appeared to be restraints built into one wall, metal fixtures that could be used to hold a person in place, though she did not see anyone restrained at the moment she looked into the room. Blackwood was furious that Sarah had seen even this much and threatened her with severe punishment if she ever spoke about what she had seen to anyone, a threat that apparently kept her silent for years, though she eventually did tell other enslaved people what she had witnessed. The theories about what Blackwood was doing in the forbidden room ranged from the plausible to the fantastic, but they all shared a common recognition that whatever was happening was deeply wrong and was probably connected to the suffering and death of enslaved people who had been taken into that room. Some believed Blackwood was conducting medical experiments, which was not uncommon among antebellum physicians who saw enslaved people as convenient subjects for testing treatments and studying diseases. Others thought he was practicing some form of torture or punishment that he did not want others to witness, perhaps because it was extreme, even by the standards of a society that accepted horrific violence against enslaved people as normal. Some believed Blackwood was engaged in occult practices, that the room was used for rituals that required privacy and secrecy. And a few believed that Blackwood was simply insane, that the room was where he indulged private madness that he managed to hide from the outside world behind his facade of being a successful planter. These theories were not mutually exclusive, and it was possible that the room served multiple purposes, or that what Blackwood was doing there combined elements of science, violence, and irrationality in ways that defied simple categorization. What was clear to everyone who lived and worked at Blackwood Manor was that the room represented something dangerous and evil, and that Blackwood's obsession with it was absolute. By the late 1850s, the number of unexplained disappearances at Blackwood Manor had become significant enough that even white authorities, who normally paid no attention to what happened to enslaved people, began to notice and ask questions. Between 1842, when the room was completed, and 1860, at least 23 enslaved people had disappeared from the plantation under circumstances that could not be satisfactorily explained by the usual reasons of sale or escape. Local officials questioned Blackwood about these disappearances, and he provided paperwork showing that some of the missing individuals had been sold to traders passing through the area, that others had run away and could not be recovered, and that a few had died from disease or accidents and had been buried on plantation grounds. The documentation was sufficient to satisfy authorities who did not want to investigate too closely, because Blackwood was a wealthy man with political connections, and because missing enslaved people were not considered a serious matter worthy of extensive investigation. But the discrepancies in Blackwood's records, which careful analysis would later reveal, suggested that at least some of the documentation was fabricated, and that the fate of the missing individuals was not what Blackwood had officially reported. The true number of people who died or disappeared in connection with the Forbidden Room would never be precisely known, but evidence that emerged decades later suggested it was significantly higher than the 23 cases that had attracted official notice, possibly as high as 40 or 50 individuals over the 20 years the room was in use. The Civil War's arrival in Mississippi in 1862 created the circumstances that would finally expose what Blackwood had been doing in the Forbidden Room for 2 decades. When Union forces began advancing into Mississippi in early 1862, Blackwood recognized that his plantation would likely be in the path of Union occupation, and that he would not be able to maintain his operations or protect his property. He began making preparations to flee further south, transferring portable assets and attempting to secure valuables that could not be easily moved. But he faced a serious problem with the Forbidden Room. Whatever was in that room represented enormous risk if discovered by Union forces, both because of what it would reveal about his activities and potentially because of legal consequences he might face even in the chaotic conditions of wartime. So Blackwood spent several days in the room destroying evidence, removing items, and apparently attempting to clean the space of traces of whatever had happened there over the previous 2 decades. Enslaved people at Blackwood Manor watched smoke rising from the 3rd floor as Blackwood burned papers and materials, and they noticed him carrying various items out of the room and burying them in locations around the plantation grounds. When Union forces were only days away from reaching the plantation, Blackwood finally locked the room a final time, nailed boards across the door to make it appear that the room had been sealed for years and was not in use, and fled south, where he would eventually end up in Texas and would live out the rest of his life without returning to Mississippi. Union forces occupied Blackwood Manor on April 15, 1862, under the command of Captain Jonathan Hayes, a Massachusetts officer whose regiment was part of the Union advance through Mississippi. Hayes established his headquarters in the main house and began the process of determining what to do with the plantation, the enslaved people who remained there, and the property that Blackwood had abandoned. During the initial occupation, Hayes and his men noticed the sealed door on the third floor and questioned the enslaved people about what the room had been used for. The stories they heard from multiple individuals about the Forbidden Room, about disappearances, about Blackwood's obsessive secrecy, and about Sarah's glimpse of restraints and strange equipment convinced Hayes that the room needed to be investigated. On April 17th, Hayes ordered his men to break down the door and conduct a thorough search of the room to determine if it contained anything that might be militarily valuable or that might provide intelligence about Confederate activities. What they found when they entered the Forbidden Room was so disturbing that Hayes immediately ordered the room sealed again and wrote detailed reports that he marked as classified, not to be shared with anyone except his direct superiors in the Union Army command structure. Hayes's official report, which was discovered in Army archives in the 1940s by historian Robert Chunn, who was researching Union occupation of Mississippi, described the Forbidden Room in detail that made clear why Hayes had felt compelled to classify the information immediately. The room contained extensive evidence of medical experimentation on human subjects, experimentation that appeared to have been conducted over many years and that had resulted in significant suffering and likely in numerous deaths. The large table Sarah had glimpsed was covered with notebooks filled with Blackwood's handwriting, documenting experiments he had conducted on enslaved people who had been brought to the room. These experiments included testing the effects of various drugs and poisons, studying pain tolerance under different conditions, investigating how long human beings could survive without food or water or sleep, testing surgical techniques that were experimental or that Blackwood had invented himself, and examining the physiological differences between races, which Blackwood appeared to believe would support theories about black people being fundamentally different from and inferior to white people. The notebooks described specific individuals by name, providing details about their physical characteristics, about the experiments conducted on them, and about the results, including in many cases their deaths. Hayes counted references to 37 different individuals in the notebooks, though some entries were incomplete or illegible, and the actual number of victims might have been higher. The room also contained physical evidence of what had been conducted there. Hayes's report described jars containing preserved organs and tissue samples, labeled with names and dates, surgical instruments that showed signs of extensive use, restraining devices built into the walls and furniture that could hold subjects immobile during procedures, and stains on the floor and walls that appeared to be old bloodstains that Blackwood had attempted to clean but had not been able to completely remove. The drainage channels that the construction workers had noted in 1841 made horrible sense in light of what Hayes discovered, clearly designed to allow blood and other fluids to be washed away during and after experiments. The room had apparently been cleaned extensively before Blackwood fled, with many items removed and destroyed, but enough physical evidence remained to confirm the testimony in the notebooks and to make clear that Blackwood had been conducting systematic medical torture on enslaved people for approximately 20 years. Hayes was an experienced combat officer who had witnessed battlefield carnage and who was not easily disturbed, but his report conveyed genuine shock and horror at what he had found. He wrote that Blackwood's experiments combined the worst aspects of scientific curiosity with complete absence of moral constraint or human empathy, treating enslaved people as experimental animals to be used and discarded in pursuit of knowledge that was often scientifically questionable, and that served mainly to satisfy Blackwood's personal fascinations. The question of what to do with Hayes's discovery was complicated by military and political considerations. The Union Army was in Mississippi partly to liberate enslaved people and partly to defeat Confederate military forces, and the discovery of Blackwood's experiments could have been used as powerful propaganda to demonstrate the moral corruption of the slaveholding South and to justify the Union war effort. But military commanders who reviewed Hayes's report decided that publicizing the discovery would create more problems than it solved. They worried that describing such extreme medical torture might actually generate sympathy for Blackwood as an aberration rather than reinforcing anti-slavery sentiment, because most Northerners wanted to believe that slavery was evil, but that it involved normal forms of exploitation rather than sadistic scientific torture. They worried that freed enslaved people at Blackwood Manor, who learned the full extent of what had happened in the Forbidden Room, might take violent revenge against white civilians in the area, creating disorder that would complicate Union occupation. And they worried that the scientific details in Blackwood's notebooks, if made public, might be seized upon by scientific racists in both North and South as evidence for theories about racial difference, even though Blackwood's methodology was completely invalid and his conclusions were worthless. So the decision was made to classify Hayes's report, to seal the room again with explicit orders that no one was to enter it, and to keep the discovery secret except within the highest levels of Union military command. This decision meant that Blackwood's crimes were never prosecuted, that the victims documented in his notebooks were never officially acknowledged or honored, and that the truth about the Forbidden Room remained hidden for another 80 years. The enslaved people at Blackwood Manor who were freed by Union occupation in 1862 knew that something terrible had been found in the Forbidden Room, even though military authorities would not give them details. They observed the soldiers' reactions when they emerged from the room, noted the immediate resealing and the orders that no one should approach it, and drew their own conclusions about what Hayes had discovered. Most of them were not surprised that Blackwood's experiments had been as bad as the worst theories that had circulated in the slave quarters, because they had lived under Blackwood's control and had witnessed his capacity for cruelty even in the normal operations of the plantation. What angered many of them was that the Union Army, which had supposedly come to liberate them and to punish slaveholders who had committed crimes against humanity, was covering up Blackwood's crimes rather than exposing them and pursuing justice for the victims. Several formerly enslaved individuals from Blackwood Manor attempted to tell their stories to Union officers, to journalists who came through the area, and to authorities who were supposed to be investigating Confederate war crimes. But they were consistently dismissed or ignored, told that they were exaggerating or that what they were describing was impossible, or simply prevented from speaking to people who might have taken their testimony seriously. The pattern of dismissal and suppression reinforced the truth that the freed people already knew, that even in the supposedly enlightened North, the suffering of black people was considered less important than political and military expediency, and that justice for enslaved people was always secondary to other considerations. Cornelius Blackwood lived until 1879, dying in Texas at age 71 from natural causes without ever facing legal consequences for the crimes he had committed in the Forbidden Room. He had fled Mississippi in 1862 with portable assets that allowed him to establish himself comfortably in Texas, and he lived out his final 17 years as a respectable member of his local community, known as a former Mississippi planter who had been displaced by the war, but who had successfully rebuilt his life. He never returned to Mississippi, and apparently never attempted to recover property he had abandoned there, suggesting that he knew the Forbidden Room's discovery made it impossible for him to safely return. But he also never faced prosecution or even serious investigation for what he had done, because the classification of Hayes's report meant that authorities who might have pursued the case never learned about it, and because the testimony of formerly enslaved people was not considered sufficient grounds for legal action without corroborating evidence from white witnesses or official documentation. Blackwood died wealthy and apparently unbothered by guilt about the dozens of people he had tortured and killed in pursuit of his twisted scientific curiosity, demonstrating that the antebellum system of slavery and its aftermath not only permitted such crimes, but protected the perpetrators from consequences even after slavery itself had been abolished. The Forbidden Room at Blackwood Manor remained sealed for decades after the Union Army's initial classification decision. The plantation house was eventually purchased by a family who converted it to other uses, and successive owners were apparently told that the third-floor east wing was structurally unsound and should not be entered. A cover story It prevented anyone from discovering what was really inside. The room became something of a local legend, with stories circulating about a sealed room that contained something dangerous or valuable, though the specific truth about Blackwood's experiments was not known to the general public. The house changed hands several times through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and at various points, owners considered breaking into the sealed room to determine what was there, but none actually did so until 1943, when the building was being demolished to make way for new construction. When demolition workers broke through the walls of the Forbidden Room, they found a space that had been untouched since Hayes had sealed it in 1862. Most of Blackwood's notebooks and equipment had been removed by Hayes and stored in Army archives, where they would eventually be discovered by historians. But some physical evidence remained, including the restraining devices built into the walls, the drainage channels in the floor, and various items that Blackwood had apparently hidden, or that had been overlooked during the earlier removal of evidence. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the room's history, and researchers began investigating what had actually happened there. Robert Chun's discovery of Hayes's classified report in Army Archives in 1946 was the breakthrough that finally brought the truth about the Forbidden Room to public attention. Chun was researching Union Army medical activities during the Civil War and was examining records from various regiments that had occupied Mississippi. He found Hayes's report filed under medical documentation from the occupation period, and when he read it, he immediately recognized its significance, both for understanding the extreme cruelties of slavery and for documenting how those cruelties had been covered up even by the supposedly anti-slavery Union Army. Chien spent several years tracking down additional documentation about Blackwood, interviewing descendants of enslaved people who had lived at Blackwood Manor, and analyzing what remained of the physical evidence from the Forbidden Room. His findings were published in 1950 in a detailed academic article that generated significant public attention and that forced a long overdue reckoning with what Blackwood had done and with how his crimes had been concealed for nearly 90 years. The publication sparked debates about whether the Union Army had been right to classify Hayes's report, about whether justice could still be pursued so long after the crimes had occurred, and about what responsibility contemporary society had to acknowledge and memorialize victims of atrocities that had been deliberately hidden from historical memory. Chun's research allowed reconstruction of at least partial information about some of Blackwood's victims, individuals whose names appeared in the notebooks and who could sometimes be connected to descendants still living in Mississippi. One of the victims was a man named Jacob, who had been a skilled carpenter at Blackwood Manor and who had been subjected to experiments testing pain tolerance in 1844, experiments that ultimately killed him, though Blackwood's records claimed Jacob had died of disease. Another was a woman named Mary, who had been used in experiments testing the effects of various drugs in 1846, drugs that left her mentally incapacitated before she died from what Blackwood recorded as complications from the experimental treatments. A young man named Samuel had been subjected to surgical experiments in 1849 when he was only 16 years old, experiments that Blackwood described in his notebooks with clinical detachment, despite documenting Samuel's suffering in detail. These individuals and others like them had been erased from official memory, their deaths explained away with lies, their suffering known only to the other enslaved people who had lived at Blackwood Manor and who had passed down oral histories about the Forbidden Room and about the people who had disappeared into it. Chun's work restored their names to the historical record and ensured that their stories would be known, though it came nearly a century too late for any form of justice or accountability inflicting, and that he should be understood as a pathological outlier rather than as representative of slaveholder behavior more broadly. The truth is probably that all these factors were present to some degree. Blackwood clearly derived satisfaction from the power he wielded over his victims, but he also appears to have had genuine intellectual curiosity about human physiology and about racial differences, even if his methods were completely unethical and his conclusions were scientifically worthless. He lived in a society that taught him that black people were fundamentally different from and inferior to white people, and this ideology made it psychologically possible for him to experiment on enslaved people in ways he would never have considered acceptable if applied to white subjects. And he may well have had psychological characteristics that made him more willing than most people to inflict suffering, though whether this constituted mental illness in a clinical sense or simply represented the extreme end of a spectrum of cruelty is unclear. The question of how representative Blackwood's case was of broader patterns in antebellum medical practice is important for understanding both the specific horror of the forbidden room and the more general relationship between slavery and medicine in the antebellum South. Historians have documented numerous cases of physicians conducting experiments on enslaved people, and the practice was common enough that it cannot be dismissed as the work of a few aberrant individuals. J. Marion Sims, often celebrated as the father of gynecology, developed his surgical techniques through repeated experimental operations on enslaved women without anesthesia. Physicians throughout the South used enslaved people as subjects for testing new treatments, studying diseases, and investigating anatomical and physiological questions that they could not ethically study using white subjects. Medical schools in the South relied heavily on bodies of enslaved people for anatomical dissection, often acquiring these bodies through grave robbing or through purchases from slaveholders who sold dead enslaved people's bodies to medical institutions. This widespread exploitation of enslaved people for medical purposes created a context in which Blackwood's experiments, while extreme in their systematic cruelty and their isolation in the forbidden room, were not completely aberrant. The difference was partly one of degree and partly one of publicity, with most medical experiments on enslaved people happening in hospitals or medical schools where they could be presented as legitimate scientific work, while Blackwood's experiments happened in secret in a locked room where even he seemed to recognize they could not be publicly acknowledged. The memorial questions raised by the Forbidden Room case have been contentious and remain unresolved. Descendants of enslaved people who were victims of Blackwood's experiments have advocated for official recognition of what happened, for memorials honoring the victims, and for acknowledgement by institutions that benefited from medical knowledge derived from experimentation on enslaved people. Some have called for monuments at the site of Blackwood Manor, identifying it as a location where medical torture occurred and naming the known victims. Others have proposed that medical schools and hospitals that used enslaved bodies for research and education should establish scholarship funds or other forms of reparation acknowledging their historical complicity. But these proposals have faced resistance from multiple quarters. Some oppose memorialization on grounds that it focuses on atypical extreme cases rather than on the everyday violence of slavery that was more common and more representative. Others argue that singling out particular victims for memorial implies that other enslaved people who suffered and died deserve less recognition. Still others resist any form of memorial that might be seen as criticizing medical science or that might complicate narratives about medical progress. These debates reflect broader controversies about how to memorialize difficult history, about whose suffering deserves public acknowledgement, and about whether acknowledging historical crimes requires contemporary institutions to accept responsibility or provide remedies. The legal and ethical questions about medical research using enslaved subjects extended beyond the historical cases to influence modern medical ethics and research regulations. The revelations about Blackwood's experiments and about more widespread medical exploitation of enslaved people contributed to growing awareness in the mid-20th century that medical research required strict ethical guidelines and that vulnerable populations needed special protections against exploitation by researchers. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which came to public attention in 1972, demonstrated that medical exploitation of black subjects had continued long after slavery's end and reinforced the need for comprehensive research ethics regulations. The resulting reforms, including the establishment of institutional review boards and requirements for informed consent, or partly motivated by recognition of how enslaved people and their descendants had been abused by medical researchers who saw them as convenient experimental subjects rather than as people deserving of dignity and protection. In this sense, the Forbidden Room at Blackwood Manor and the medical crimes that occurred there had a legacy that extended far beyond the specific victims to influence how modern medicine thinks about research ethics and about the protection of human subjects. The story of the Forbidden Room also illuminated the complicity of supposedly anti-slavery institutions in covering up slavery's worst atrocities when exposure was deemed inconvenient or politically problematic. The Union Army's decision to classify Hayes's report rather than publicizing Blackwood's crimes demonstrated that even institutions fighting against slavery were willing to suppress evidence of slavery's horrors when that evidence did not serve their immediate political or military interests. This pattern of selective exposure and suppression extended beyond the Civil War period to shape how Reconstruction and subsequent historical narratives presented slavery and its aftermath. Atrocities that fit convenient narratives about Southern barbarity versus Northern enlightenment were publicized and used for political purposes, while atrocities that complicated those narratives or that raised uncomfortable questions about Northern complicity were often buried or minimized. The result was a historical understanding of slavery that acknowledged its evil in general terms while obscuring specific horrors that were too disturbing or too politically inconvenient to confront directly. The Forbidden Room's nearly 90-year suppression exemplified this pattern and demonstrated how historical memory was shaped not just by what happened, but by deliberate decisions about what to reveal and what to conceal. The psychological impact on the enslaved community at Blackwood Manor of living for 2 decades under the shadow of the Forbidden Room was profound and intergenerational. The people who worked at that plantation knew that some of their friends and family members were being taken to that room and were suffering terribly there, and they were powerless to prevent it or even to fully understand what was happening. They lived with constant fear that they or their loved ones might be selected next for whatever Blackwood was doing behind that locked door. And they lived with the knowledge that white society and even the Union Army that supposedly came to free them would not hold Blackwood accountable or even acknowledge the full extent of what he had done. This trauma was passed down to descendants through oral histories and through the psychological effects that such profound helplessness and terror create across generations. Descendants of Blackwood Manor's enslaved community, interviewed by historians decades later, described how their families had been marked by what happened there, how the memory of the Forbidden Room and of the people who disappeared into it had shaped their understanding of slavery and of the capacity for human cruelty, and how the suppression of the truth about Blackwood's crimes had reinforced their distrust of official narratives and their conviction that powerful institutions could not be relied upon to pursue justice when that justice was inconvenient. What should we remember about the Forbidden Room at Blackwood Manor and about the decades of medical torture that occurred there? We should remember that slavery enabled not just economic exploitation and routine violence, but also permitted the worst forms of sadistic cruelty and experimental torture that individuals like Blackwood chose to inflict. We should remember that the victims of this torture were real people with names and families. People like Jacob and Mary and Samuel, who suffered and died while Blackwood recorded their pain with clinical detachment. We should remember that even institutions that opposed slavery were willing to suppress evidence of its worst horrors when that suppression served their political interests. We should remember that justice delayed for decades is justice denied, and that the 90 years it took for the truth about Blackwood's crimes to become public meant that neither he nor anyone who helped him was ever held accountable. And we should remember that medical science's history is not just a story of progress and discovery, but includes a legacy of exploitation and abuse of vulnerable people, particularly enslaved people and their descendants, and that this legacy requires acknowledgement and shapes our understanding of what ethical medical practice must be. The Forbidden Room at Blackwood Manor was finally destroyed when the mansion was demolished in 1943, but its legacy persists in historical memory and in ongoing debates about how to reckon with slavery's crimes. The room represented the extreme end of slavery's capacity to enable human cruelty, a space where one man's absolute power over other human beings allowed him to indulge scientific curiosity and sadistic impulses without restraint or consequence for 2 decades. The suppression of the truth about that room for nearly 90 years demonstrated how powerful institutions protect themselves and their interests, even at the cost of justice for victims of atrocities. And the eventual exposure of what happened there, thanks to Robert Chung's archival research and to the oral histories maintained by descendants of Blackwood Manor's enslaved community, demonstrated that buried truths have a way of surfacing eventually, and that historical crimes cannot be hidden forever, no matter how determined the efforts to conceal them. What do you think about Cornelius Blackwood's medical experiments and about the Union Army's decision to suppress evidence of his crimes? How should we balance the impulse to memorialize specific victims, like those who died in the Forbidden Room, with the recognition that millions of enslaved people suffered and died in ways that were never documented? What responsibility does modern medical science have to acknowledge and reckon with its history of experimentation on enslaved people? And what does the Forbidden Room tell us about the nature of slavery and about the capacity of systems of oppression to enable and conceal the worst forms of human cruelty? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this investigation into the Forbidden Room challenged your understanding of slavery's horrors and demonstrated the importance of exposing suppressed historical crimes, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to uncovering the truths that powerful institutions tried to bury, to honoring the victims whose suffering was deliberately hidden from historical memory, and to ensuring that the crimes of the past are acknowledged even when that acknowledgement is uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that slavery's evil extended beyond routine exploitation to include systematic medical torture that was concealed for nearly a century. The Forbidden Room at Blackwood Manor has been destroyed, but the truth about what happened there must be remembered. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, every crime deserves to be exposed, and every attempt to suppress historical truth must ultimately fail. The door to the Forbidden Room was locked for 2 decades, and its truth was suppressed for 90 years. But now you know what was behind that door. Remember it.